And so to see the fear in everyone's eyes, it was just very shocking. And it was very heartbreaking because they're looking to me for answers that I didn't have and a lot of people didn't have at the time.
This is Heal Your Part, and I'm Jennifer Herrera. I'm on a mission to help you heal what's in the way so you can see yourself the way your soul does. Because when you heal your part, everything shifts. This episode is a special one. I'm joined by someone I deeply admire, Anahiz Correa, a former colleague and a leader I had the privilege of working alongside in the healthcare system during the pandemic. When I met Anahiz, she was already an extraordinary ICU manager, clear, capable, and grounded. And over the years, I watched her grow into something even more powerful, a leader who leads with humanity. She's now the Senior Director for Critical Care Services at Martin Luther King Jr. Community Hospital. And what she shares in this conversation is something I think everyone, inside and outside of healthcare, needs to hear. Even though the pandemic has officially passed, the impact on healthcare workers really hasn't. The profession is still healing, still rebuilding, and still reckoning with what it means to care for others without losing yourself. This conversation is about that, about leadership, vulnerability, and the courage to stay human when everything asks you to harden. Let's get into it. Well, welcome to the Heal Your Part podcast. My name is Jennifer Herrera. I am your host, and I'm so excited to finally be having this conversation with somebody I deeply admire and a past colleague, and her name is Anahiz Correa. And welcome, Anahiz. Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to have this conversation, and I so appreciate you, being willing, as I know this is not necessarily something that you're used to doing on the daily, given the work that you do. This journey on Heal Your Part really came from well before my career starting in healthcare. However, it makes sense to me now because it's always been a part of my focus, and it was such a gift to be in that setting and meeting people like you. Before I get down the rabbit hole there, I just wanted to invite you to introduce yourself and share a little bit about your personal journey and how you arrived into the career of healthcare and anything that feels present for you to share this morning.
Sure. So my name's Anahiz Correa. As you mentioned, I am currently working as a senior director for critical care services. But my journey into healthcare was rather interesting. I knew from the beginning, since I was a little girl, that I wanted to be a nurse. And when people ask, what is it that inspired you? When did you start your nursing career? For a lot of individuals, it's later in life. But for me, it really was when I was 5 years old. And my aunt in Mexico was a nurse. She would come home. When we would go visit in the summers, she would come home and she was dressed in her all white scrubs, and she would wear her nurse cap, and very traditional. And she would show me her stethoscope, and she would go ahead and ask me to listen to her heartbeat. And I would ask her, what is it that you're doing every day? What is it that you do as a nurse? And what does that mean? And she would just tell me, I just take care of people. That's what I do. I'm just taking care of people and I'm making them feel better. And I thought, I want to do this. This is exactly what I want to do. And I always thought that I just want to make people feel better. And since I was a little girl, I said, I want to be a nurse. I didn't quite understand what that meant, except for making people feel better. And so my plan was always that. I graduated high school with highest honors, and I only applied to 3 universities, and they were all nursing programs. And this has been my only career. This is all I know. So nursing and healthcare.
Wow. Honestly, I had no idea. That is such a beautiful story. I mean, truly. And I was envisioning your aunt when you were describing her, and
what I recall seeing on the TV when I was growing up about what a nurse looked like. I always held it in such a high esteem. So that's very romantic, Anahiz. And now I also know another reason why I'm drawn to you, just that call to help people feel better, like the simplicity of that. So thank you for sharing that. And I'm wondering, and you can guide this conversation because I know that the COVID-19 pandemic was a different experience for everybody. And it's significant for me in many ways, some of which you know, but as it relates to you and I, it's significant because I feel like my experience within the organization that we worked at together changed when you started to kind of experience, when I felt like maybe your experience changed a little bit, at least from my purview. And it opened up new opportunities for me to also understand more levels of the experience as it related to how it was impacting the healthcare workers. During the COVID-19 experience, I know you were leading the ICU, which was, I would imagine, the most impacted part of most healthcare institutions. My question really is around your COVID-19 experience as a leader, but also I know that you were leading one of the most impacted parts of a hospital, the ICU. And whatever is comfortable and present for you to share, I'd love for you to reflect on your experience, how that changed you as a person, as a woman, as a leader. Any of that would be really interesting to bring into this conversation.
You for asking about this. It's very challenging to think back of that time, but I think for several reasons. Of course, everything that we experienced during that time period, but it was also a period where I had a lot of personal growth in my own personal life and my own personal relationships and how I viewed the world. Um, every day. And thinking back on that, there was just a lot personally going on. And the world took that pause. And I think I'm not alone in this. I think a lot of people had that time to really think and grow. And so when I think back, I like to really look at the entire timeline, or I try to look at it from 1,000-foot view of me as a person. So when I'm thinking of when I first started as a leader within the ICU, I actually grew in that ICU, right? So I started off as a staff nurse and then a charge nurse, and then I became a manager. So I was managing my peers that I grew alongside. And I had been managing that ICU for about 2 years when the pandemic hit. And it was just very shocking. I knew these individuals personally. I knew their kids, their partners, a lot about them. And so to see the fear in everyone's eyes, it was just very shocking. And it was very heartbreaking because they're looking to me for answers that I didn't have and a lot of people didn't have at the time. But when I'm thinking of my leadership during that time and how that changed, when I was a charge nurse, I was very much having to make decisions, very quickly and looking at maybe even transactional, right? Like, we have to move this patient. I'm going to change your assignment. This is what we're going to do. This is what I need from you in order for this to happen or this patient to come through. And also servant at the time. So I can do these tasks for you and that'll free you up for another patient to come in. I really had to be that transactional servant leader. Then moving into the manager position and leading a team, I really switched into more of a democratic. So I'm like getting people's feedback, trying to make positive changes, doing everything possible to make it a better working environment for the team. And then COVID hit, and I thought, well, I don't have the power to ask them for their insight to make any of these changes. There's a lot of things happening very quickly, and we're guided by the latest evidence and the latest guidelines. And so I really reverted back into that servant leader. So what can I do for you so that you can make it through this shift? What can I do for you so that you can go home safely? What can I do for you so that you feel comfortable enough to even return and stay in healthcare? We had a mass exodus at the time, not just at our organization, but throughout healthcare, from physicians to nurses. And so that time really just made me see my team as human beings, like fragile human beings that have needs more than just beyond things to make the workplace better, right? Beyond things to make them feel safe. There was a huge need and a huge gap for us to be able to even fill that wellness, that psychological safety, that emotional safety. And those were areas where I wasn't really too strong in. I grew up not really discussing a lot of our emotions or exploring our emotions. Growing up in a Hispanic family, we never grew up saying I love you before hanging up a phone call or before leaving. We didn't really hug each other as often. And so there was this huge shift I had to make, where I myself had to be vulnerable enough so that I could then help my team through everything that was happening. So I really had to exercise that skill and become vulnerable, which is really hard because you can't just say, well, I'm going to be vulnerable at work, but I'm not going to be vulnerable at home. And that really impacted my personal relationships as well. Even with my own partner, being vulnerable with my boyfriend was really challenging, even for me, just because it just changed the dynamics, and not in a bad way, but we really had to even just learn each other and this new aspect of each other and this new growth that we were both doing. And yeah, that time period was extremely painful for many reasons, but growth itself is something that people think might be not easy, but something that comes natural. Like, oh, you just grow and it's something natural, but it actually takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of dedication, and it can be very exhausting to just learn this new piece of you and this new part of you. It also raises a lot of things you've ignored across the years as you've grown up, and having to manage those areas that are coming up while also managing the current trauma that's happening to you. It's extremely exhausting. So that's a little bit about that time period for me and that growth during COVID.
Wow, thank you. I'm reminded as you're talking how one of the things I really appreciate about you is just the clarity of how you express and share things. And I felt like you took me back on a timeline and also invited me into other layers that, I think some parts we have discussed, but not fully in that way. And the complexity of all of the concurrent things happening at once, and then even your growth as a leader and being able to really define those different stages and moving in between the servant and democratic, and then learning that you had to shift back because of the unknowns of all that was going on is really palpable. And I can hear in your voice that, I think a lot of big things, a lot of traumatic things stay with us in some shape or form for most of our life. And I think the challenge and part of what inspires me to have this podcast, because I do believe that the impact of trauma when we're actually really young and have no context or skill, and we haven't, I think historically as a at least in this country, addressed all of that then that is stored in the body and it impacts who and how we become. And then it becomes even more difficult to handle other things and or look at that. So when you were talking and explaining like the reality of that challenge, I really heard that. And it kind of reminded me, like, not to be so simplistic, but it's like that term growing pains, and that it tends to push us in ways that our ego that's trying to always keep us safe is really resisting and it's uncomfortable. But you just also sharing like how that was impacting you and how you related to your feelings and emotions and that going back to your family and all of that. So I think that is a powerful explanation about, I think, how a lot of people, especially in healthcare, were experiencing this because, and I'm just going to skip to a question that I feel like the word resilience kind of became like a bad word, or that just might be my perspective. But I feel like even before the pandemic, it was a word used a lot in healthcare, and I think it became overused. And I think it became a word that maybe people felt resentful of because I felt like how it was coming across was like how to be more resilient, which I think it translated to how to just keep going and not really address all that really is going on and why we even have to be saying resilience. But with that in mind, I'm just curious, how do you define resilience? And maybe how has your relationship with that, or even if you even use that word, how has that shifted over time?
I'm so glad you brought up the word resilience because I 100% agree with you. It's a term that's just, and I'm going to date myself as a millennial, but just gives me the ick. And at that time, people love to say, what is it? Heroes work here, and our healthcare workers are heroes, and they're so resilient. And I just think it's a word that people don't truly understand, and it's kind of a throwaway, right? It's a way to it almost feels a little dismissive, if I'm going to be honest. It's like, oh, you guys are resilient, and that's something that just healthcare workers are. But to me, it's overused, right? And it really lost its meaning. It has no substance. So to me, resilience is just a way for people to say, well, as healthcare workers, you are adaptable and you are able to face everything that comes your way, and you are able to accommodate to all of the challenges. But it's not sustainable, right? It's not something that is truly going to last for a long time. So I think really what individuals that really stayed during the pandemic and have stayed past the pandemic, I think what they truly have is grit. I don't think it's resilience. And there's a huge difference in that, right? And the reason why resilience is also a big turnoff is we are resilient, but there needs to be a solution to why we need to be resilient. So a great example is the increase in workplace violence in healthcare. There are no real solutions to the systemic challenges out in the community that are causing these events to come into the hospital. There aren't any resources out in the community for individuals who need care for mental health, right? And so when they end up in our organizations, we don't have the resources to, transfer them out. There aren't enough mental health institutions available. There aren't enough mental health beds available for us to be able to say the care that this individual really needs is related to mental health. It's not a medical issue, it's a mental health issue. And so we are seeing a higher and higher and higher volume of workplace violence incidents. And so for people to say, well, you're so resilient to be able to handle this on a day-to-day basis. Well, it's not sustainable. And we can see it in the amount of individuals leaving healthcare, right? And the nursing shortage and the physician shortage. People don't want to go to work to be abused. And so it's a well-known fact that workplace violence in the healthcare setting is actually 6 times higher than that in the private sector across the United States, in any private sectors, in any other line of services. It's just a symptom of something larger. So for me, for people to say, well, you're resilient, you're able to adapt, you're able to do the work for the patient. Well, that's not going to be sustainable. What we really have is grit to be able to get us through these challenging situations, but how many people are we going to lose along the way? For some time when I would go after COVID, I went to a few conferences and there were so many workshops about resilience. And I just was so turned off. I could not attend because I I didn't quite understand at the time because we were fresh out of COVID and we were starting back up to, meet as leaders and attend conferences and share our knowledge. And I couldn't quite understand why I just couldn't even attend those sessions. But over time, as I'm able to just think back and reflect, I think this is really what's happening is the individuals that are left have that grit to continue, but it's not resilience.
Well, I imagine that many of your peers are clapping their hands and can relate to how you reflected that. And that was my sense. That was what I've picked up. And I was actually involved in creating a training for physicians years before I even joined this healthcare system. But I felt the same thing of how much it was present, especially with COVID. And I did feel like it lost its meaning and that it was being misused. And it just reminds me of becoming another buzzword that happens in corporate America, which includes big institutions like academia or healthcare. And there was something in there that you said that I thought was so key around, and now I'm having a hard time recalling it, but it was something around, it definitely lost its meaning, but that there's no solution. And so then it becomes trite. It becomes, how I heard you was like, I don't even want to go to those sessions. It's like almost offensive. And I think that you distinguishing it as, in your experience, it being grit, that sounds much more relatable to me. And I think there is a real challenge with sustainability of the workforce in general, because we're still operating off of a very old system. Like, why did we decide 40 hours a week when that's not even actually how many hours people work? But then healthcare is a whole other sector. Thank you for calling out the workplace violence piece as well and that statistics, because that is very, very powerful. And I do think that is not talked about probably very much at all, especially not outside of the sector. And it's real. So thank you for that explanation. And I hear in your voice and what you're sharing, Anahiz, that I feel a sense of hope for leaders like you that can be so clear, and there's an equanimity to how you're sharing. Yes, you're sharing your feelings about it and you have an opinion about it, but it's not jarring. And I think that's also why things don't always make progress, because when people feel really passionate about something, or that's when they start to take action on something, and then at that point they're really outwardly emotional about it, which can be off-putting to other people who can't handle that. I want to sidestep that and just talk a little bit about, given this experience and this quality, and maybe you answered it here, but if there's anything else you might share around, what do you think makes someone choosing the field of healthcare? Is there a quality you think they have in common? And I'm just also curious, like, what have you learned over the years? Like, what do you admire most in, it could be a direct report, it could be a peer, like what have been some of those qualities that have surfaced? I'm sure COVID was a big conduit for that as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So, obviously there has to be compassion. There has to be caring. Those are values that you have to hold very close to you and have a lot of meaning for you. I do think that over time in healthcare, however, that's been lost a little bit. I would say probably in the last few decades, there's been a lot of discussion of you earn a lot of money in healthcare. And there are individuals who might get into healthcare. Maybe their drive is, monetary compensation. But then that leads to a lot of that burnout as well. I do think you have to go into healthcare for more than just the money, for more than that, to be able to really last in healthcare, because there are a lot of difficult situations that you see that you thought you would never see. When I first became a nurse, I started off in a telemetry unit, and my patients were alert and oriented for the most part. And I had a lot of discussions and interactions with them. And so as a brand new nurse. I really wanted to learn everything about my patients and talking to them. And I would look over into some of the other nurses who, were towards the end of their career. And at times they were rude or not dismissive, but just short. They didn't want to take that time to interact with their patients. And I always thought, I don't want to be like that. And so, how do we not end up that way? You have to be able to care and continue to care. So, during COVID, what we actually saw was a lot of the staff because we're in survival mode and it's completely understandable. But there were some staff members and even physicians who felt like caring was too painful and they shut down. And it was really difficult to see because they were very passionate individuals prior to COVID and they just became these zombies. They were just very matter of fact. I just need to get through the day. And at times they were even angry. They were even angry that they were having to take care of patients with COVID because, what was happening outside of healthcare, all of the political discussion or discord surrounding masking, not masking, etc. And so those individuals that were once very compassionate and caring just shut down. And as the leader, I had to really be able to identify those individuals and provide that support, knowing that those are the individuals that are hurting the most and need the most assistance. So how can we get them back to their caring and compassionate characteristics, right? And you helped me during that time. And so we identified that need and that need for support for individuals like this to prevent that burnout. Because once you turn off that switch, is really hard to turn it back on, right? And I would say that a lot of people, I think, learned the importance of having that care and compassion. And those people that couldn't turn it back on, I think, have transitioned out. Several individuals left the ICU and did things outside of healthcare even. I know that one of our respiratory therapists left healthcare altogether and she became a personal trainer. I have another individual who I know left bedside altogether and moved into the telehealth sector. And other nurses who left the ICU or the acute care setting really and went into primary care. It was just really interesting to see that period and how different people coped and those that completely shut it down. But I think you and I, our partnership and our collaboration during that period really helped make sure that we could support those individuals so that we didn't all become zombies and all lost our care and compassion.
I so appreciate you sharing all of that. And yes, and I was really grateful for that collaboration. I'm wondering real quick, would you just share with the listener, what is ICU acute care telemetry? Just briefly, just describe the difference, the nuances.
Sure. So ICU is the intensive care unit. That's where you're, critically ill. You're requiring more intense care. So you're provided with close monitoring from nursing and physicians. Telemetry is that step down. So you're in the hospital for some monitoring, but doesn't require intense monitoring. So you're probably out of the hospital within 3 days. And acute care is really what we refer to the hospital setting. So you have an acute illness that requires you to be seen at a hospital, whether it's the emergency department, intensive care, telemetry, et cetera. And then, primary care, we all know that, right? So our primary care physicians. So everything before the hospital setting.
Okay. No, thank you for that. And also telemetry is often where you go after you're no longer needing to be in the ICU. Is that correct?
Correct. Yes. So it's the before and after. Not everybody makes it to the ICU, thank God, right? So telemetry is really that. It's just that monitoring and that observation that's needed for whatever acute illness you might have.
Okay. And just one more thing I'll mention, because I'm aware of this, obviously, without the technical, but the respiratory therapist also became a very key partner with the ICU during COVID, because they were the ones who were typically responsible for the intubation when that stage of the illness happened. Is that correct? Would you describe it differently?
Yes, so definitely the intubation, the management of the ventilators. So during COVID, a large portion of our ICU COVID population required mechanical ventilation. I would say greater than 80% of those. And in telemetry, we had a lot of COVID positive patients as well. While those individuals were not intubated, they were also requiring what we call high flow nasal cannula. It provides some positive pressure. It's more than just a regular oxygen delivery. So it's providing that pressurized oxygenation. And so those individuals are in the border of requiring intubation. So they really expanded throughout the entire hospital, from the emergency department, telemetry to ICU. So that service line also faced a lot of challenges.
Yeah. That's why I wanted to clarify it, because I think just to paint the picture for those that are not as familiar with healthcare, of course, COVID impacted everybody, and it also impacted healthcare across the board. I have a cousin who was married to a doctor who has always been in geriatric care, and he lost like 82 patients, and it changed him. So I know that had its impact. And what I wanted to call out is between the ICU and the respiratory team. So if you were a respiratory therapist, you were like up close and personal with some of the most, like, someone's ability to breathe for themselves. And so that layer of COVID, the intensity of that has its toll. And I appreciate how you reflected on the experience that different people were having, and how people internally took care of themselves, whether they were aware of it or not, consciously or unconsciously. And also it's people honoring and shifting out. One brief thing I'll mention is that you reminded me of in the early stages, I was hosting these listening sessions however we could, as safely as we could. And I remember one very distinctly that was on one of the telemetry floors, and we were able to meet, I think, 6 people at a time, and everybody in there worked together, but they had not heard each other's sharing how they're feeling about everything until that moment. None of them knew how the other person was feeling about it, because they were all there to do their work as whatever role they played in the hospital setting. And it was fascinating to me. It was deeply moving and touching. And I remember one newer nurse whose whole family was in nursing. And I think this is like 3 months in, about maybe 4. And at this point, I believe her entire family had stopped working. They pulled themselves out. They were not comfortable. And I think she wanted to stop too, but she was feeling, how I heard it, is like a level of shame that, like, I just started. What does that say about me if I quit now? And I say all that because I feel like, yes, healthcare workers are in this field and they've been trained, but I don't think anybody went to medical school or nursing school or any kind of preparation thinking they were going to ever face a global pandemic. And I think that's what also hasn't really been talked about and addressed. And I think in really constructive, honoring ways, or at least that's just from my purview.
I mean, absolutely. Even within healthcare itself, right? There was a type of not shaming, but I would say probably a little bit of judging for those that maybe went on a leave of absence during COVID, or people that transitioned out of the hospital, out of the acute care setting. There was a little bit of judgment, and I found myself at times as well, of like, how can they not want to come and help? This is what we're supposed to do. This is what we're here for. And, this is what's expected of us. But I think that was really the adrenaline, that initial shock of what was happening in the world. But as we realized this was not going to be a 2-week, issue as it was projected to be, as we saw that this was extending for months and months, a lot of us really looked over to each other and said, I don't blame them. I would, if I really wanted to, I could. And some of us joked around of yeah, I'm going to go on my leave this month. You can go on your leave next month, and we can all rotate so we can all take a break. But I mean, the majority of the team didn't. But there definitely was this sense of, you have to come and do this work. How dare you not show up? And I think we do that to each other at times, right? But I think over time, a lot of us learned that they were taking care of themselves. They were taking care of their family. They were taking care of whoever. That was really not up to us to dictate or judge or decide. They were doing what was best for them. And we continued to do what was best for us. And if it was meaningful for us to continue to do this work, that's what we were doing. That's why we were showing up every day. So at the end, I admired some of the individuals who decided to take care of themselves. It takes a lot of guts to prioritize yourself. So good for them. I'm really proud of those people.
I appreciate that. It does take a lot of guts to take care of yourself, especially if you work in healthcare. Ironically, like
Absolutely.
that's that's the irony that I know is not lost on anybody, but I appreciate that kind of full circle moment that you reflected. And I do think that when we're really, I know this from me in just everyday life, when we're tired, when we're exhausted, we are tend to be much more short and judgmental of ourselves and everything because we're exhausted. And I would imagine that pretty much everybody was pretty strung out with COVID, the pandemic experience, but definitely those who worked in healthcare. So thank you for that. And I want to kind of zoom out and get a little bit more of a outside of just the COVID experience, but obviously that was very much a part of your development as a healthcare worker and also as a career leader in your progression in this field and maybe just irregardless, but I think it obviously has a lot to do with it. But you've likely faced moments of self-doubt or, people questioning you or just external challenges or however you had to navigate and or advocate for yourself. How did you do in that regard? Anything you want to share about that and how you overcame that?
So absolutely. There's a lot of imposter syndrome, not just at work, but even in certain spaces outside of work, that I think a lot of women face. But as a first generation Mexican American woman, it's also something that I'm continuously fighting and telling myself, I belong in this space. I'm here for a reason. I worked really hard to get where I am, and I am deserving of everything that comes my way. Having to repeat that to myself over and over, can be very challenging because sometimes the other voices win over, right? That self-doubt. But what I've learned early on in my career as a leader is you have to find what is your driver. So what is your why? Why are you doing this? And focus on that rather than doing this work for somebody else. You really have to think of what does this work mean for me and what can I control rather than focusing on all the things I cannot control because that will drive you insane. So that's really how I've been able to just overcome that self-doubt. Additionally, what's been helpful for me is mentoring others and bringing others along in the journey and sharing my knowledge because it reinforces, right? Some of that, what I've learned is meaningful and useful. And I also get that validation from others of, oh, wow, thank you for sharing this. And, I had never learned this before, or I never saw things this way. And it's been very interesting to just see that growth, I would say, of allowing the voices to overcome versus being able to manage. They never quite go away. I think people think, oh, well, you stop feeling that. It never ever goes away, but you're able to manage them a little bit more and just take a pause and say, okay, why am I having this self-doubt? Why is this voice coming up right now? And trying to understand where it's stemming from, just so that you really know what that trigger was and being able to identify it and then say, no, that was just a trigger, but I do belong here. I am doing the right thing. And I'm able to take up space here. This is okay.
Yeah, that was a powerful little lesson that you articulated. And I feel like what you're describing or how I'm hearing it is is maturity, or in the workplace, how I always referred to it was like time and position, but maturity as a human and being awake to your growth and that you have options besides the feelings that we have, because feelings are usually pretty much always stimulated by an idea or a belief or a thought. And what I hear you describing is, how you've grown and learned how to work with yourself, work with what, creeps up on you, or how, and I think everything is a part of that for each person, where we come from, what our cultural background is, what was our home unit like, what were our examples, and then of course, everything throughout our adolescence and then on. That is a really clear example about, I think, how people could take note to notice that those things may not stop, but that we can change our relationship with them and how we work with them. And I do think over time, at least I can say this because at least, I think, 15 years older than you. It's like I can attest, and I have had other women express this to me closer to my age, that over time, because I do believe our values shift, and I think that only comes with life experience, where we start to see the things that really would shake us and impact us and hold our attention and cause a lot of suffering, they start to fall away. We definitely have our own little demons, I think, that we work with, but it can be, I think, very intense when you're coming of age, especially as a woman and especially as a woman of color. So, and if you're somebody, like you mentioned, being a first generation Mexican American and establishing a lot of firsts in your family can feel like a gift, but also it's a lot of pressure and responsibility. So, taking a note from that, I'm just curious, the question that's coming forward around pride of culture, is there like something from your cultural background or even just your experience growing up, a quality or an aspect of you that you feel like has really served you in your career? Or I'm really thinking about, like, how has your heritage prepared you for who you are today?
I would say for my heritage, as far as like helping me, I would just say seeing my parents, I'm first generation. So the struggles they lived and how hard they worked to provide day in and day out, it was a huge driver for me and continues to be a huge driver for me to do what I do and continue to strive to be better. My dad worked 6 days a week and worked 10 to 12-hour shifts. And my mom would work sometimes two jobs or work a job, and she went to school. She actually became a phlebotomist and then worked in a lab, became a sales rep, became really proficient in English, and even opened up her own business during COVID. So seeing the strength and such a strong woman, and being able to share that with her kids, that drive, that really just helps me to keep going and not stop.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's amazing. That is a really cool arc as you're describing your mom's progression, and I can relate to a lot of what you shared. What's something that you've learned about yourself from the last maybe 5 years or so?
I would say the one thing from the last several years is that self-awareness, having that, just being self-aware and being able to pause. I would say that's the one thing that I definitely achieved in the last few years. And it was painful because I realized how many years of my life I lived not being self-aware. And it was really hard to accept that. And maybe how I even showed up for other people, right? With that lack of self-awareness. But I would say now being able to pause and reflect has been so useful for me in both my personal life and at work, to not be so reactionary or to not be so closed off to others, because that was easier, right? I would say that that's probably the one learning from the last several years is having that self-awareness rather than living life without knowing what I'm feeling or processing what I'm feeling and thinking.
Yeah. I think those are key things that I wish more people would have. So I appreciate that. And I can attest to that, at least, the purview I've had into your life. And I think part of the reason why I'm drawn to you is because of the quality of the conversation that we can have. I'm not saying it's better for me, but I appreciate that there's a level of depth that you can have when we can look at the dimensions of ourselves, but it's not easy. So as we're wrapping up, a little lighthearted question, if you could have dinner with any three women, living or historically, who would you choose and why?
I would definitely, as far as living, I would want to meet with Sonia Sotomayor. She's in our Supreme Court justice. So I would want to just pick her brain as to how she continues to take up space in a very, very divided, space with a lot of opinionated individuals. So I would like to just understand a little bit more of how she's able to do that and get that background from her. And the other individual that's also living, I really appreciate how outspoken AOC is. So Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez. I think her and the new congresswomen are just the future. They're the future that's for positive, right? They're very outspoken. They're representative of of the working class, of what we are experiencing. And I think it would be very fun to meet with those two individuals.
I appreciate that. And just hearing that and learning that, and it makes me think more too. So thank you for that, Anahiz. Well, you said a couple of pearls earlier on, but as we wrap it up, I'm just curious if you have any thoughts or what comes present to you in this moment of like somebody who's wanting to start a career in healthcare and even maybe wanting to be in leadership. Is there something or a tip or something you might reflect to them to consider?
I would say you don't have to be the hero. Everyone expects you to be the hero, but you don't. Self-care is extremely important. Healthcare is ever changing, and there are large, large challenges, systemic issues that are outside of your control. So you have to be able to prioritize taking care of yourself so you can take care of others. So that's really, really important. Having healthy coping mechanisms, starting therapy if that's something you feel like you need, whatever that is for you, if it's working out, if it's therapy, if it's a combination, but having a pretty solid self-care plan or routine so that you can really last in healthcare, I think that's something that I would prioritize. It's not something that's been discussed prior, but it's something that's very, very important. I think of our careers and the work that we do, it's a marathon, not a sprint. We have to find ways for us to stay engaged and be able to take care of others, but it starts by taking care of ourselves.
1000%. Thank you. I could not have said that any better. Well, I just want to say thank you. Thank you. I know how precious your time is. I so value it. I'm so grateful to have this conversation. Perhaps we'll have you back and get to learn a little bit more about your journey, because I do think that you are representing a field and a voice that is not represented. And I just have learned so much even in this short conversation. So thank you for spending some time with me and for being a guest on the Heal Your Part podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
I want to thank Anahiz for this conversation, for her work, her honesty, and her heart. If you're someone who works in healthcare or you love someone who does, I hope this episode reminded you that caring deeply is both a gift and a weight, and that it's okay to need care too. If something in this episode moved you, please share it with a friend or colleague. And as always, thank you so much for listening, for reflecting, and for being a part of this work. Please subscribe to the podcast so you get notifications when a new episode is out. And remember, your healing, your presence, your awareness, they matter. When you heal your part, you help heal the whole. Until next time.